For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
Attention is not, in this case, noticing stuff. I mean, noticing's good. Paying attention to stuff and, living an intentional life and spirituality is all important. But what she really wants is this sense of open and ready to be used. That whatever it is, another person, the mathematical problem, whatever, sort of enters in and takes you over. And if you think of the psychology of that, it's really profound because we often want to pay attention to something in order to learn it, to master it, and then we can use it, and that's all to the good. But in fact, the moral concern that she's exhibiting here, particularly as you look at another human being, is that you're letting them into your life and you don't know what the hell's going to happen. And in this case, that's where she's particularly concerned. This is how we can see, the only way that we can see affliction and those who are afflicted, because we find them horrid, we find them repulsive, and we're scared to death that it could happen to us. Why are you going to open yourself up to that? You can notice that, and you can give charitably and do all sorts of do-gooding. But the sort of attention of even recognizing that the person's afflicted is very different. I mean, it means you have to make space for them. And then the person who no longer exists suddenly has a place in human society again.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. On August 24th, 1943, a 34-year-old woman named Simone Weil died in France. The coroner declared her death a suicide, cardiac arrest from self-starvation. But the enigmatic Simone Weil was much more complicated than that, both in her life and her death. She had already been sick with tuberculosis, and in an act of solidarity with so many others in Nazi-occupied France, she willfully had reduced her rations to a minimum. And it wasn't the first time she'd opted for hunger or voluntary affliction in an act of solidarity. When she was 6 years old, she and her brother swore off sugar for the sake of the troops on the Western Front of World War I. Throughout her life, she identified with what she thought of as the soul-destroying experience of demeaning labor. Working-class women, children, and men giving their experience a close, muscular attention, taking up their cause, and formulating a philosophical, theological, moral, and political perspective with the data of affliction, oppression, and marginalization. And not a little bit of Plato. Born into a secular Jewish family, she was exposed to Christianity early on, being drawn into a feeling of belonging. She provocatively wrote in her spiritual autobiography about this early conviction that, quote, Christianity is preeminently the religion of slaves, that slaves cannot help belonging to it, and she, among others. When Simone was almost 30 years old, suffering from debilitating migraine headaches, she had what she thought of as a mystical encounter with Christ while staying at a Benedictine abbey in Solmay, France, listening deeply to the Gregorian chant during Holy Week, and attentively praying the lines of George Herbert's Love Bade Me Welcome. She would write that, quote, Christ himself came down and took possession of me. This episode is the first of a short series exploring how to read Simone Weil, the author of Gravity and Grace, The Need for Roots, and Waiting for God, among many other books, essays, letters, and notes. Weil has been an inspiration to philosophers, poets, priests, and politicians for the last century, almost all of it after her untimely death. She understood, perhaps more than any other armchair philosophers of the same period, the risk of philosophy, the demands it made on human life. In this series, we'll feature 3 guests who look at this magnificent and mysterious thinker in interesting and refreshing and theologically and morally challenging ways. We'll look at Simone Weil the mystic, Simone Weil the activist, and Simone Weil the existentialist. First, we'll be hearing from Eric Springsted, a co-founder of the American Weil Society and his longtime president, who wrote Simone Weil, Late Philosophical Writings, as well as Simone Weil for the 21st Century. We'll also learn about her perspectives on justice and her lasting influence on feminist writers from Cynthia Wallace, Associate Professor of English at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan, and author of The Literary Afterlives of Simone Weil, Feminism, Justice, and the Challenge of Religion. And finally, we'll explore Simone Weil, the Existentialist, with Deborah Casewell, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Chester, author of Monotheism and Existentialism, and co-director of the Simone Weil Research Network in the UK. In this conversation, Eric Springsted and I discuss Simone Weil's personal biography, intellectual life, and the nature of her spiritual and religious and moral ideas, how she pursued philosophy as a way of life, her encounter with Christ, affliction, and mystery, her views on attention and prayer, her concept of the void and the call to self-emptying, and much more. Thanks for listening.
Eric, thank you so much for joining me for a conversation.
Thank you for inviting me to have it.
Tell me a little bit about why you got interested in Simone Weil. You've been, I imagine, reading and working on her for a long time.
Yeah, probably, I think 47 years.
Yeah.
I was an MDiv student at Princeton Seminary, and I had the good fortune of working with Diogenes Allen. And at that point, and this was the early 70s, he was working on Iris Murdoch. And as a result of that, because Murdoch said she had borrowed so much from Weil, he started reading Weil. I was actually interested in Plato, but he said, she has a lot of interesting things to say about Plato.
Yeah.
So he said, why don't you try that? So I read her for the first time in 1975 and been hooked ever since. And I did my dissertation with him. And then after that, we both jointly founded the American Weil Society.
Yeah. They say you were hooked. Tell me a little bit about the experience of being hooked by Simone Weil. I gather that these days, most people who are aware of her work know her as a mystic, maybe a Christian.
Yeah.
There's some question about the trajectory of her faith, but someone will offer a pithy quote. For me, I think it was the poet Christian Wyman,
right,
quoting her as a beloved influence in his early poetry.
Right.
I think the direct quote was, all poets are exiles. And so there's an intrigue, there's a mystique about Simone Weil, maybe even a kind of romantic quality to her life and thought. What hooked you?
Well, I think it was probably the Plato. I mean, what I discovered in her is I kept reading her. And I think I was fortunate in just reading her in the beginning. And so I was able to mull it over. And somebody had once asked me, well, how had she changed your mind? The thing is that I was 24 years old. I didn't have much of a mind to change, or what I did needed changing. But reading her through all of those years, and including the beginning, was a matter of her forming my thought, of actually thinking along with her.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where some people will say, oh, she really turned me around. I mean, she's been a partner through almost my entire intellectual life. Yeah. And in many ways was the fulfillment of what I expected intellectual life and the life of faith to be.
You speak about intellectual life and the life of faith. Tell us a little bit about that for her biographically. And it does seem like the distinction between life and thought breaks down with Simone Weil. For her, a way of being in the world is philosophy itself. Tell us a little bit about her history, personal life.
Well, she was the second child of a French physician and his wife, both bright in their own way. Her older brother, by 3 years, was one of the 20th century's greatest mathematicians, Andre Weil. And so intellectual life within that family was extremely important. She was never a person to sort of poo-poo intellect in favor of action. However, one thing that became very important for her when she was studying in the French lycée system, she taught by a French philosopher by the name of Alain, which was the pen name. His name otherwise was Émile Chartier. He very much had a lot to do with her Platonism, but he also insisted on thought making contact with it. You never theorized. I mean, it was a matter of coming into contact with whatever object it was that you were trying to think about. In that sense, for her, intellectual life, which was philosophy, was a matter of an active life. It was a matter of sort of experimenting with life itself to make thought realize itself.
But she seems to take it seriously at a level that is uncommon for a young person in general, perhaps at the time. But you get the sense that the level of seriousness with which she takes the ideas that she is in fact coming into contact with, encountering, or becoming acquainted with, as necessitating a kind of change of her own life.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the milieu that she grew up in, intellectual life was extremely important. And I mean, the people around her would also have been just as serious about intellectual life. But where she was, again, different was that the action that she felt that she had to commit herself to in order to finally figure out what was going on. I mean, probably the best example is when she was 33 or so, she had already written what she called her first grand oeuvre, which was reflections on liberty and social oppression. It was a wonderful piece. It's a great critique of Marxism. It's an attempt to try and figure out how there can be freedom and dignity in human labor and action. And yet, a year after having finished this, she took a year off from teaching and went to work in 3 French factories doing piecework. Now, she thought she was going to find the final pieces by coming in contact with the workers. She thought she would find a type of honest camaraderie that you don't always find among intellectuals. And unfortunately, what she found was affliction.
Yeah.
But then that set the program for quite a while afterwards. And how you dealt with that.
Say a little bit more about this retreat from intellectual life. I mean, for Weil, because of her intellectual commitments, right? This retreat, it also reminds me, perhaps it's for different, maybe vastly different reasons, but it reminds me, for instance, of Wittgenstein retreating to the hills of Austria to teach kindergarten or to build his own cottage or whatever. There's a kind of temptation to retreat that you seem to find in plenty of intellects. But what was going on for Weil?
Well, Wittgenstein's the appropriate example. He had said philosophy is a matter of working on yourself. And she, for never having read him or even heard of him, says pretty much exactly the same thing.
Interesting.
And that isn't a solipsistic, how do I perfect myself? But if philosophy is a matter of thinking, it's a matter of making your thinking yours and also right. He had the same sort of strong moral concern about how thought goes. I mean, it's so easy, particularly in the modern world, to assume that the thought floats above everything and observes it. Thomas Nagel once said, the view from nowhere.
Right. Yeah.
Perhaps that's what we aspire to, but both of them thought that's not simply objective. It's a matter of personal morality as well.
Okay.
And you just don't separate the two out. I mean, in that regard, it's Platonic as well. Not only is the unexamined life not worth living, But virtue and intellect go hand in hand.
Yeah.
You don't have one without the other.
So she was expecting to find community in the blue collar and worked in these factories in the hopes of, it seems out of solidarity, a moral commitment to solidarity.
That was a good part of it. But I mean, some of it was honestly an experiment to figure out how work was done.
Okay.
And through her entire life, she had a real concern with this. Anytime she saw anybody working, whether it was as a farmer or as a harvester in the grape harvest or a fisherman, she wanted to join and she wanted to figure out how it was done.
That's incredible. And yet she finds affliction there in your words. I recall her writing about the demeaning nature of factory work, that it was just so below the dignity of a human being, that she found it probably, I think, both physically and then spiritually just destructive.
Yeah, I mean, she had, when she'd written that previous essay on the cause of liberty and social oppression, she had theoretically assumed that even though human beings always have to labor, that it is possible to do that with dignity if one understands the necessity in it. I mean, even the science of it. And if one understands that, the logos of it, one can consent to it. I mean, it's really a very stoic position. But human dignity and freedom comes in consenting to the life that you have to live and not trying to keep kicking against it and trying to be something else. The problem is, as you were saying, is that in this factory work, she realized that it was inherently degrading. I mean, not just sort of degrading, not just sort of, I don't want to do this degrading. It was that, in fact, it destroyed the soul. And often when people talk about affliction, what they want to go to is something like the worst suffering they can imagine. And yet, the clear examples she had of people who were afflicted were the factory workers. And they came to work every day. They went home to their families. They probably drank too much on the weekends, but, sort of normal people. But she began to realize there's nobody home inside.
Yeah.
And she would not say that she herself was afflicted, but she began to realize that. And as sort of the whole system weighs down on them, they start weighing down on themselves. There's a self-hatred that goes along with that. And you just don't, she said, you don't recover from that easily. It has a certain amount of pain, so you can't use imagination to pretend you're somewhere else.
Does she draw this from her own experience? Does she draw it from conversations with coworkers, or just reflecting on the process that she undergoes in doing factory kinds of work?
I think some of it's her own experience. She kept a journal while she was in the factory, and there's one really striking story that she tells. And she said, one day I was getting on the bus, and it suddenly hit me how for 6 sous I can ride this convenient public transportation. And she felt, I don't have any rights. Why would anybody let me on this? If somebody threw me out of the bus, I would have said, all right, you're right. I don't belong here. And this is again a person who has a very strong sense of her own self and of her rights and would argue with anybody about it. And then suddenly she gets the taste of this. And she realizes that's often the entire life of people who are working in factories. She knows she can walk away. I mean, so in her experience, she's not saying, I was afflicted and, now I've come back to tell you about it. She says, I was touched by it. And this is what I observed. And this is what is going on with people who are working in these factories all the time.
Yeah.
And she began to realize that these people are around us all over the place.
I wonder if you can help us get some context here. We know a little bit about her family and the kind of the place of intellectual life, the place of scholarship and the life of the mind. But what are her spiritual roots? Because she becomes this deeply mystical person, mystical writer, and yet doesn't emerge from a religious background.
Yeah. Well, what happened in the factory was extremely important because it shattered all of the confidence that she had, and including the idea that human beings, even if they were under harsh necessity, could consent to it and have some kind of dignity. And she realized, no, it's actually possible to lose yourself, to lose your soul, to lose all sense of meaning. And she notes that it was shortly after that that her parents sort of rescued her. They took her on vacation to Portugal, and she had what she said was the first of her mystical experiences. She had been watching a number of fishermen going out, and they were singing ancient songs. And she said, it just dawned on me at that point that Christianity was a religion of slaves and that she couldn't help belong to it. Suddenly she realizes that, and I think this is what's truly insightful in her case, and it's pastorally important, that Christianity was not meant to take away the suffering, but it took away the meaninglessness in the midst of suffering. I mean, affliction could rip out our inner being. Faith could possibly let us keep it. But that assumption was also, or that thought was, that was not possible on our own. We could not see the necessity, give consent to, and save ourselves.
This is like the role of waiting,
right,
and the role of grace,
right.
And this is where it really begins to compound. So Christianity as the religion of the slave, I think that deserves a little bit of explanation. What does she mean by that?
I think we can go to another experience. She talked about three that were important. Second one, she doesn't talk much about it. It was just that she was in Assisi and in the Church of St. Francis, and she said something made me go down on my knees. And this wasn't a woman who went down on her knees very easily at all. But the third experience, I think, is really the important one. And it gives a lot of content to what she's thinking. She was with her mother in Salem, France, and it was during Holy Week. They were going to the Holy Week services there in Salem. And the monastery there had a particularly interesting and different type of Gregorian chant. That's really what they had gone for. But at that point, she was suffering from migraine headaches, and she'd suffered from them from the time of being a young girl. And it was excruciating. But at that point, she had met two young Englishmen. I think one very well may have been an American. And they taught her George Herbert's poem, Love. Yes. Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. And she memorized it, and she just would keep repeating it to herself. And she said, I realized that afterwards that this was like a prayer that I was repeating constantly. And then she said, in the midst of one of these services, as they were singing, with each sound like a hammer to her head because of the migraine,
right,
that she had a personal visit of Christ. And it's very interesting because she's very specific about how she talks about it. She says, it didn't make the suffering go away. My flesh was still heaped up in the corner, but somehow there was also something of me somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And she said, it was like the smile on a beloved face. You can't doubt it. Somebody that you care about smiles at you, exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
And so she said, I half refuse my intellect. At that point, she realized that Christianity was not meant to get rid of suffering, but could make a use of it. Reflection is utterly useless. It's just simply destructive of the human being.
Right.
But in fact, in the supernatural, in God, in faith, she realized that somehow even affliction could be a way of contact between human beings and God. Because in fact, it stripped away all of the extraneous stuff. There was nothing left of your own ego, of all of your pretenses, and it was a pure and bright contact.
I think we need to talk a little bit about the role of mystery then for her. Help us orient ourselves to, it might require a brief word about like just a tradition of mysticism in general and the role and what mystery entails. But how does Simone Weil approach the question of mystery? And especially when she is not one to easily or quickly leave the intellect behind.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are some philosophers, Heidegger probably being one of them, who I would say was a mystery monger. He's sort of delighted in obscure and pointing at high things.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Here is a genuine mystery, and she speaks in very plain language. She does not use jargon at all. Like Wittgenstein, whatever could be said clearly.
Yeah.
But what she felt mystery was, and she gives a definition of it, it's when two necessary lines of thought cross and are irreconcilable, yet if you suppress one of them, somehow light is lost. So one needs to hold on to both of them, and you don't know how. There is no way of defining it. And just even to give some sort of concrete example to that, go back to her experience in Salem. Her point is that whatever good comes out of this personal contact with Christ does not erase the evil of the suffering. Her thinking, as she develops it from here on in, there is a type of good and evil that are compensatory. They're pluses and minuses against each other. Yeah. But she believes that there is an absolute good that is not a compensation and does not erase the evil. And it also, it's not on the level of the other type of good. So that type of good is a mystery. It's something that is complete, satisfying, etc. But it isn't pie in the sky and the sweet by and by. It isn't a compensation. And that's the word she uses. It's not a compensation. Because if it were, it would be on the same level as the evil that it transcends.
In your book, you talk about mystery as drawing a person into involvement with contradictions, as opposed to either like trying to smooth out, erase, explain, resolve, solve them in any way. What is Weil's approach to involvement in contradiction? Like, what is it to be involved in that way?
She thought contradiction was an inescapable mark of truth. And she's very clear about this. As she writes on philosophy itself, she thinks anybody who's getting rid of the contradictions and putting a system into place, and she thought Aristotle and Hegel were both guilty of this, are not real philosophers. Real philosophers are the ones who just live with contradictions. In that regard, she was very much like Wittgenstein.
Right.
The contradiction is actually a sign of depth. On the one hand, and this is very Platonic, contradiction pushes you to a higher level. If you're going to resolve it, if it's there, if you're going to try and resolve it, and you're going to have to move to a different plane. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, she didn't think, like Hegel did, that you were going to find a final solution.
Interesting.
It was just simply beyond the human being. but you can participate in it. There's a light shed on that as you hold on to it, sheds light on all sorts of things of life.
Yeah. I want to camp out a little bit more on this because I think at a time where perhaps more scientific or philosophical approaches to faith, more rational approaches to faith seem to have been ineffective in retaining younger generations' attention toward Christianity in particular, but perhaps religion broadly. I wonder about this kind of the role of mysticism in this way and the role of mystery. And you talk about a few values or a few significant ways that mystery is very important for Weil. And the first is, well, I'll rehearse them here and you can see what sticks, see what jumps out to you now. But what I've noted is the universe cannot be put into a box with techniques or tricks or our own scientific methods or philosophical methods. Mystery instills humility, and it kind of takes the question of the knowing ego out of the picture. And it challenges modern society to resist the idea that faith could be reduced to a dogmatic system.
Yeah. And I mean, I think all of those things are right. One thing I would add is that in the end, faith is not a matter of the intellect anyhow. I mean, the intellect is astounded by
Category.
Yeah. But ultimately, mysteries, and this includes church mysteries, are not philosophical mysteries, but in fact, they're matters, she says, for contemplation and hence for love. If you want to talk about something like a faculty psychology, what are our faculties? Intellect is not, in the end, the highest faculty for love is.
Yeah.
I mean, in that sense,
right.
And she probably resisted the designation, but she was very Augustinian. I mean, in that sense, very much at the heart of what was the real heart of Christianity. And intellect follows, and intellect delights in this.
Sure.
But in fact, it's very much a matter of understanding coming from faith.
Yeah. Faith that seeks understanding or leads to understanding. This might be a good place to dip into the right use of school studies with the view to the love of God. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about dipping in a little there. In particular, what jumps out to me about this essay of hers is that really lovely distinction that she makes between muscular effort and negative effort. And she's talking about attention. And when we're talking about the faculties of intellect and love and a faith that leads to understanding, I just associate that with the kind of language that she uses about the attention. So you can give us a little bit of background, like what this essay is trying to do, where it comes from for her. And I'd really like to kind of like work out how the stuff about mystery and now faith that leads to understanding, how does that intersect with the concept of attention for Weil?
Well, the essay was written about 1942, 41.
Which is a late essay, right?
Right. She was in Marseille. The family had escaped on the very last train out of Paris before the Nazis moved in. And they spent the next couple of years, she came into contact with a Dominican priest there and became very close to him, although in her own distinct way. I mean, I think he wanted to convert her and she wanted to convert him, and she did, actually.
Now, convert, bears ask you, like, convert him to what?
To the universality of grace. That Plato was a pre-Christian. And, good Neotomist that he was, they had it all worked out. And she wanted to argue, and she did. I mean, many of her essays out of this time are on the ancient Greeks, which came out in a volume, but nicely titled, Intimations of Christianity Among the Ancient Greeks. And it includes a long essay on God and Plato, which apparently was really lecture notes that she gave for the group that he had put together in Marseille.
Yeah.
And he was always a little worried about sort of the peculiarities of her approach to faith, but he really was convinced in the end that grace was universal, not exclusive to the Christian faith, or particularly the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah. Anyhow, he had asked her to write an essay for a girls' school in Marseille, a Catholic girls' school, and this essay was written for girls in high school, basically. And the idea was how school studies actually contributed to the love of God. But the key to that was not just, well, you got smarter, you got more insight by doing this. It was, she said, it doesn't matter what the intellectual result is.
Yeah.
If you're looking at a mathematical problem and don't just screw up your face and have a muscular effort of trying to understand it, but just looking at it and its insolubility, she says, that develops attention. And attention, she, in the end, says, is ultimately what prayer is. Now, there's a particular, a definition that she gives in the midst of that essay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she says the soul has to be unoccupied with anything else, and it needs to be, if you got the quote.
Well, I don't know. I'll read this and you see if this connects. Attention consists of suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. It means holding in our minds within the reach of this thought, but on the lower level and not in contact with it. The diverse knowledge we have acquired, which we are forced to make use of. Above all, our thought should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that is to penetrate it.
And those three adjectives, empty, detached, and ready to be penetrated, are the important ones.
Okay.
And the second one is particularly important, but it's a mistranslation. I think it's a bad translation. Detached.
And what's the French?
The French is disponible, which is also a commonly used Spanish term. And it's a very concrete term. If you're in a line and say at the bank, and one of the tellers now suddenly the last customer is gone, that teller is now disponible, available. So detached really in that sense is available. I mean, and
unattached maybe.
That would make sense. But it is also sort of empty, but it's also ready for use.
Yeah.
Attention is not, in this case, as too many people end up making it, noticing stuff. I mean, noticing's good. Paying attention to stuff and living an intentional life and spirituality is all important. Yeah. But what she really wants is this sense of open and ready to be used. So that whatever it is, another person, mathematical problem, whatever, sort of enters in and takes you over.
Yeah.
And if you think of the psychology of that, it's really profound, because we often want to pay attention to something in order to learn it, to master it, and then we can use it.
Sure.
And that's all to the good. But in fact, the moral concern that she's exhibiting here, particularly as you look at another human being, is that you're letting them into your life and you don't know what the hell's going to happen. and in this case, that's where she's particularly concerned. This is how we can see, the only way that we can see affliction and those who are afflicted, because we find them horrid, we find them repulsive, and we're scared to death that it could happen to us. Why are you going to open yourself up to that? I mean, you can notice that. I mean, you can give charitably and do all sorts of do-gooding, and one shouldn't prove that. But the sort of attention of even recognizing that the person's afflicted is very different. I mean, it means you have to make space for them. And then the person who no longer exists suddenly has a place in human society again.
That's very interesting. Because if that affliction was so destructive to their soul, that this would be well, is it right to call that a form of solidarity?
I don't think it is right to call it solidarity. I mean, I've heard people talk about this in any number of ways. It's not empathy. I mean, empathy is sort of we will to put ourselves in that other person's moccasins, as it were, to walk in them. This is, you don't know what's coming, but just simply out of some sense of love, you let them into your life. And the afflicted, as she says, often because of their own self-hatred, will react with savage ingratitude. This isn't something that's going to happen and you're going to walk away feeling really proud of yourself. It's going to change your life.
Yeah. But it looks like it's necessitated by, the very fact of how she approaches philosophy as a practice of encountering the object. And when that object's another human being, it's to come into full contact and then, but not maybe not in a completing way, in a way that now opens you up for the freedom of whatever that relationship could be. And that is what is giving life to that. Part of it is
there's no relationship, actually.
Oh, really? No relationship?
Yes, in this case, it's very different than Buber's I, thou.
Okay.
You're certainly not treating the other person as an it. There's a sense in which it's thou, but it's not mutual. There is no mutuality with somebody who's nobody. She's really very insistent about this. She doesn't want a payoff, other than perhaps the good that it may do the afflicted. But again, we don't know how they're going to react. So one just simply makes oneself open and available, and one recognizes it. Now, the good that can come out of that, as I just mentioned, is that they've been excluded from human society. Human society, as we push and pull, and there's a sort of mutuality in that, they are pushed, and that's it. And that's why generally even very kind gestures towards somebody who's in that position are going to push them over, even though you didn't mean it, because they don't resist. In this case, for somebody to be actually void and then ask, what are you going through? And they recognize that you're not trying to get something out of it. Suddenly they're given space to be a human being.
I've heard this phrase used of they, that into the void, that's a space where love can go.
And that's that sort of love and goodness that is not compensatory. That doesn't go into the void.
All right. Yeah.
A good that needs a compensation is never in the void.
Well, for Vey, probably not even love.
Yeah. It could be an implicit one. She is a thinker, by the way, who thinks from the top. She thinks it from the perfect on down.
Sure.
She doesn't move up incrementally. As Iris Murdoch once said, and I think she may have had Vey in mind, she said, in the Sermon on the Mount, it's being perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, not be ye therefore slightly improved, which is what all of us really like.
I want to ask a little bit more about attention insofar as attention is identified with prayer. So what is prayer for Simone Weil?
Attention to God.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. And I remember having taught this to seminary students. I once asked them, I said, in the Middle Ages, if somebody was to be knighted, he would spend all night in prayer. How would you spend all night in prayer? And they come up with all sorts of things. Well, somebody had learned what was called sort of the widening circle of prayer. So you pray for yourself and maybe your family, and then you pray for the people in the city of Santa Fe, and then you pray for the people of New Mexico, and then you pray for the people of the United States. But you could do prayer by simply listening all night long.
Yeah.
Simply having the desire to want to hear. I mean, prayer is contact between the human and certainly we have reasons to ask. And she probably wasn't very big on them, but I will say as a pastor, yes, you should ask. But that isn't all of prayer. I mean, prayer is a mutual contact, and therefore what is important is voiding oneself of secondary desires and letting oneself be spoken to.
And I think we need to kind of talk a little bit more about this, because perhaps one of the most significant objections to Wei's thought that I'm aware of is that she's a self-abnegating, melancholy revolutionary, to quote Leon Trotsky, I believe is what he called her. Yeah. But that self-abnegation is really persistent and deep, or at least the appearance of self-abnegation. Maybe it just is, as far as your read. But I wanted to ask about humility in Weil, because read in one way, it's just about creating that void into which love can flow, a kind of perfect love that is only going to take place in a kind of perfect emptiness. Right. But what do you say to critics and detractors who think first of her maybe terrible prayer, the terrible prayer which asks for all sorts of harms to come to her, all sorts of lack and absences and just really terrible things? What do we do with Weil when it comes to humility and the value of or sacredness, maybe even of a person?
Well, I mean, humility is absolutely crucial, but somebody who is self-destructive is not necessarily humble. And I think she recognized that. And the self-abnegation, it may have been the extreme ways that she approached it, and may well have been a fault. She chiefly is criticized for anorexia. I mean, she just simply wouldn't eat. Wow. And that seemed to be a long-term issue.
Yeah.
And it may have well been connected to the migraine.
In some of my reading, it seemed like she was doing it out of, again, there's that word again, but solidarity or some kind of identification with hungry soldiers on the front, whether that was, or others who were just afflicted. And she felt a kind of obligation to it.
I mean, she would refuse in a highly ascetic way comforts. But I think you're absolutely right in the way that you put it. Whether she was right or not, I mean, whether she saw into herself clearly, she always had a moral reason of solidarity with others. I don't deserve this comfort because somebody else doesn't have it. I don't deserve this meal because somebody else doesn't have it. Now, I think that she probably was not medically anorectic. I mean, she didn't eat a lot, but I don't think there was necessarily that sort of pathology. And in fact, it's an interesting story. A friend of hers in New York, before they went off to London with work with the Free French, had her over to dinner. And this person was also somebody from a secular Jewish background, but ended up being a convert. And they'd have her over to dinner. She wouldn't eat it much. But then the father would get her into an argument about the Jews. And she would just get so wrapped up in this conversation that she'd finish off the steak. Yeah, I mean, it really was an ascetic practice. Okay. It wasn't necessarily pathological. But to get back to the point you made, that indeed one needs to somehow empty oneself. But she recognized, too, that you can't do that to yourself. In the same way you can't give yourself grace. And at some point she said, it's like a man who you can't be without money and give yourself a loan to tide yourself over. And that's just sort of the negative part of it. Yeah. You need to will, she says, it's like pulling up the plants. But the sun is the only thing that's going to make the plant grow. I mean, will pulls up the weeds so that it could grow. And in that case, the true self-emptying comes because of life. it happens to you. If you do it all the time, then it's simply pride. It's a self-accomplishment in a negative way. But what one has to do, and this is where attention comes in, is you pay attention, you wait, and then grace happens to you. And by the way, it doesn't always have to be a way of suffering. And she points out there is a way of joy. There is a way of intellect. And science and philosophy can be that way. Although in the end, they will all meet. Because at some point, what you've finally done is accepted the entire creation as God's will.
Can you say a little bit more about the role of waiting? And it seems to be importantly connected to attention.
Right.
Pay attention and wait.
Yeah, and in fact, there's really even sort of a little play on words in French there. Attention is you pay attention. But in time, that blooms into attente, which is waiting. And a person whose life is consistently paying attention is a person who's waiting all the time.
Interesting.
And I would say that's something that you would find in monastic practice.
Sure.
Except she thinks that it doesn't have to be in a monastery, that it's what we should be doing in the world.
That really charts out a fascinating relationship to what seems to be a kind of Christian framework that she's working within by the end of her life.
Yeah.
And is yet she's so resistant to...
She's resistant to the church. I mean, one thing that we haven't pointed out is the very obvious place that she's drawing this from. And that's Christ's self-emptying.
Yeah.
She will go on to say that God in creating the world didn't do it by power, but by withdrawing so that something other than himself could exist. But that whole idea of withdrawing is drawn from the notion of the cross. Christ's kenosis, self-emptying in the incarnation and in the cross.
So here's another maybe mystery, another contradiction, right? In that, in the withdrawing is the incarnation itself. Yeah. There's a kind of...
The withdrawing isn't just going away and watching from the sidelines.
It's not deism, so to speak.
No, it's not. And I mean, it's very Trinitarian because at the same time, the Father withdraws and the Son is crucified on time and space. I mean, so she thinks that act of the crucifixion is historically real and pointed. It has to happen at a time and place, but she refracts it into eternity.
Yeah.
That the very creation of the world is by this withdrawal and simultaneous crucifixion of the Son on time and space. Hence, the world itself, and you brought up deism, the world is not just a natural bunch of stuff. All that exists with God in the middle of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ultimately a sacramental view of life.
That is a great word for it. I mean, and it's just, again, it's so fascinating to see it in a kind of thinker who blossoms from, I don't know, she kind of gets to that fundamentally sacramental description of the world from a kind of agnosticism.
Yeah, and I think that, something could probably be said about that. She said it was agnosticism. Said, I thought about God, I couldn't figure out the answer, so I left it alone. And then she talks about this personal conversion, and she realizes that the intellect wasn't the problem at all. It was a matter of love.
Yeah.
But I would also say that the way that she approached this was she didn't want to make a mistake. And there was a quest for purity, which, may have been obsessive at some point. Yeah. But that quest for purity in morals and in thought was something that then bloomed into that notion of attention. She was waiting in a way, and it happened. She hadn't betrayed. And there's in Iris Murdoch's novel, The Nice and the Good, there's a guy who's a bit of a Pharisee. I mean, he's sort of nice. And then there's also another guy who's not so much. But he has a religious experience. And it's precisely because of the discipline that he's had beforehand that experience actually he's able to act on and make a life out of. Whereas it's not in the same novel. In the novel The Unicorn, there's a guy who's a colossal egotist. He has an experience of perfect love. Then in 3 weeks, it's gone. And that tells us also something about faith as a real practice and a matter of an active life. You just don't get hit by a lightning flash and then everything changes. I mean, you're still you, and you got to work with that. And if you haven't been much of a you beforehand, it's a lot harder than if perhaps you actually been a decent person, not profound, but decent, that in fact you maybe had some control over your own body, that you could live it out.
Yeah. That's bringing it back for me to, again, attention and her insistence that nothing productive need to come.
Right.
That nothing productive needs to come from this negative effort. And all of the productivity of muscular effort could be for naught. Mm-hmm. It's just the making available of oneself in this negative effort and a true giving of oneself to the attention as a practice, as just a rite of life. This is the way that I follow. And that's, again, like the kind of the sacramentalism of the world maybe creeping into the individual's life. Right. And it's perhaps a small comfort that no, there is a livable way within this. There is at once a kind of adventurousness and maybe even a kind of heroism that shows up in Weil, that and a courage to her life that is daunting. And if it is that kind of negative effort of really just trying to let oneself be given to.
She put her finger on what's really the heart of Christian spirituality. You know, I think even Karl Barth would accept this, although she probably, I don't know what he would do with it. But, you know, the whole idea of we live by the word. And how does that happen? You know, not by just sort of external manipulation. It's by our being open to listening to the word. I mean, back to Augustine, there's an inner person, there's an inner word who we are. Mm-hmm. And the whole point of Christian spirituality is listening to God's word and having that transformed into God's word.
Eric, this has been such a rich and delightful conversation about an absolutely mysterious, still to me, but all the better thinker in Simone Weil. So thanks for your work.
Thank you. It's been a good conversation, which is always the best thing.
Thank you so much.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Eric Springsted. Production assistance by Alexa Rollo, Emily Brookfield, Zoe Halaban, and Casey Barrett. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu or lifeworthliving.yale.edu, where you can find all sorts of resources, including past podcast episodes, articles, books, and so much more, all to help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. If you're new to our show, hello, welcome. Remember to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss the next episode. And if you're a loyal supporter and a faithful listener, we'd love it if you'd share this series on Simone Weil. Tell a friend, share an episode, put it in your social feed, mention it to your grandma or around the water cooler. We'd be grateful if you helped us expand our listening community. As always, thanks for listening, friends. We'll be back with more soon.